So this story comes from a guy we'll call Daichi. At the time this happened, Daichi was 28 years old and had just moved back to his hometown in rural Japan after finishing graduate school in Tokyo. You know how it is when you've been away for years studying, you come back home and everything feels both familiar and completely different at the same time. The job market wasn't great in the city, so when his uncle offered him a position at the local forestry department, Daichi figured why not? It was decent pay, and honestly, after years of cramming for exams and living in tiny Tokyo apartments, the idea of working outdoors in the mountains sounded pretty appealing. His hometown was one of those places that's slowly shrinking as young people move to bigger cities. Most of his childhood friends had already left for Osaka or Tokyo, so it was just him, his aging parents, and a bunch of older folks who'd lived there their whole lives. The work itself was pretty straightforward, monitoring forest health, checking for disease or pest damage, maintaining hiking trails, that sort of thing. Nothing too complicated. Daichi would drive out to different sections of the mountain forests each day, take notes, snap some photos, and file reports back at the office. For the first few weeks, everything was perfectly normal. He'd wake up around 6, grab coffee and a convenience store breakfast, then head out to whatever area was on his schedule for the day. The forests around his hometown were beautiful, dense cedar and pine stretching up the mountainsides, with little streams running through them and the occasional shrine tucked away in clearings. It was peaceful work, and after years of city stress, Daichi was actually starting to enjoy the quiet routine. But there was one area on his patrol route that always felt a little different. It was about a 40-minute drive from town, up a winding mountain road that got narrower and narrower until it was barely wide enough for his little work truck. This particular section of forest had been damaged by a wildfire about 15 years earlier. Most of it had grown back by now, but there were still patches where you could see the old burn scars, blackened tree trunks sticking up through the newer growth like broken teeth. The first time Daichi visited this burned area, he noticed it was unusually quiet. No bird songs, no rustling in the underbrush, just an odd stillness that made him feel like he was being watched. He figured it was probably just because the ecosystem was still recovering from the fire damage. Sometimes it takes decades for wildlife to fully return to burned areas. Still, something about the place made him want to finish his work quickly and get back to his truck. It was on his third visit to that section that Daichi first noticed something weird. He was taking measurements of some young saplings that had sprouted among the burned stumps when he heard what sounded like footsteps behind him. Not animal footsteps. These were deliberate, like someone walking through the forest trying not to make too much noise. Daichi turned around, expecting to see maybe another forestry worker or a hiker who'd wandered off the main trail, but there was nobody there, just the same eerie quiet and those blackened tree skeletons standing in the afternoon sunlight. He called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. Daichi stood there for a minute, listening, but the footsteps had stopped. He went back to his work, but kept glancing over his shoulder. The feeling of being watched had gotten stronger, like there were eyes on him from every direction. When he finally packed up his equipment and headed back to the truck, he found himself walking faster than usual, almost like he was being chased by something he couldn't see. That night at dinner, Daichi mentioned it to his parents. His mother just nodded and said the mountains could play tricks on you sometimes, especially in areas that had been damaged. His father, who'd worked in forestry his whole life before retiring, was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That burned section up on Mount Akagi? Yeah, I always felt strange up there too, even before the fire." But he didn't elaborate, just went back to eating his rice. The next few times Daichi had to visit that area, he tried to go earlier in the day, when there was more sunlight filtering through the trees, but the weird feeling never went away. If anything, it seemed to be getting stronger. He'd hear those footsteps again, always just behind him, always stopping when he turned around. Sometimes he'd catch movement in his peripheral vision, like someone ducking behind a tree just as he looked in that direction. But every time he investigated, there was nothing there except more burned stumps and new growth. Then, about 2 months into the job, Daichi started finding things that definitely shouldn't have been there. The first was a child's shoe, just sitting on a fallen log like someone had placed it there deliberately. It was old and weathered, but not 15 years old, not old enough to have been there since the fire. Daichi picked it up and looked around, thinking maybe a family had been hiking through and lost it. But they were pretty deep in the forest, well off any marked trail. Kids don't usually come hiking in areas like this. He brought the shoe back to the office and asked his supervisor about it. The older man just shrugged and said people sometimes dumped trash in remote areas. But his expression was weird when he said it, like he was trying not to think about something. Daichi put the shoe in the lost and found box, but it bothered him for the rest of the week. The next week, he found a backpack hanging from a low branch, just at eye level, like someone had deliberately hung it there for him to find. This one was definitely old, the fabric was faded and torn, and when Daichi opened it, everything inside was water-damaged and moldy. There were some school notebooks, a pencil case, and what looked like a lunchbox. The name written on the notebooks was too faded to read clearly, but it looked like it might have said Yuki or Yuji, something with that sound. Daichi brought this back to the office too, but his supervisor's reaction was even stranger this time. The man went pale when he saw the backpack and immediately started asking where exactly Daichi had found it. When Daichi described the location, his supervisor just nodded slowly and said he'd take care of it. But he wouldn't explain what he meant by that. And the next day, when Daichi checked, the backpack was gone from the office. That's when Daichi started to realize that maybe his coworkers knew more about that burned forest than they were letting on. That weekend, Daichi decided to do some research on his own. He went to the local library and started digging through old newspaper archives, looking for anything about that section of forest. What he found made his stomach drop. 15 years ago, right before the wildfire started, 3 elementary school kids had gone missing during a school camping trip. Their names were Yuki Tanaka, Yuji Sato, and Mika Ishida. They'd wandered away from their group during a nature walk and were never found. The search went on for weeks, involving hundreds of volunteers and search dogs. But they never turned up even a trace of the children. The wildfire started just 2 days after the search was officially called off. It burned for nearly a week, consuming thousands of acres, including the exact area where the kids had disappeared. After that, everyone just assumed the worst, that the children had gotten lost and died somewhere in the forest, and their remains had been destroyed in the fire. Reading those old newspaper articles, seeing the school photos of those 3 smiling kids, Daichi felt sick. The shoe he'd found, the backpack with Yuki written on it, these weren't random pieces of trash. They were evidence. But evidence of what, exactly? If the kids had died in that forest 15 years ago, how were their belongings showing up now, looking like they'd only been there for a few months? The next Monday, Daichi tried to bring this up with his supervisor, but the man cut him off before he could even finish explaining what he'd found in the archives. "Listen, Daichi," he said, his voice low and serious. "That area has always been complicated. Just do your job, file your reports, and don't go looking for things that aren't your business. Some stones are better left unturned." But Daichi couldn't let it go. Those were real children who disappeared. If there was any chance they were still out there, or if there were answers to be found, didn't someone have a responsibility to look for them? The Thursday, when his schedule called for another visit to the burned section, Daichi decided he was going to do more than just take measurements and photos. He was going to really search the area, methodically, and see what else might be hidden in those woods. He arrived earlier than usual, around 7 in the morning when the mist was still hanging between the trees. The forest felt different that day, more oppressive somehow, like the air itself was thicker. As Daichi walked deeper into the burned area, following a rough path between the newer saplings and the old charred stumps, he noticed that the silence was even more complete than before. No insects buzzing, no birds calling, not even the sound of wind in the branches. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. About half an hour into his search, Daiichi found something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, in a small clearing he'd never noticed before, was what looked like a camp. Not a modern camping setup, but something much more primitive. There were makeshift shelters built from branches and bark, arranged in a rough circle around what had once been a fire pit. The whole thing looked old and abandoned, but not 15 years old, maybe a few months at most. As Daiichi got closer, he could see there were personal items scattered around the camp. A plastic water bottle, some candy wrappers, a torn piece of clothing that looked like it might have come from a school uniform. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone to take pictures. This wasn't just random litter. Someone had been living here recently, and they'd had belongings that connected them to those missing children. That's when he heard it, a sound that made his blood turn to ice. It was crying, soft, quiet sobbing coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. It sounded like a child. Daiichi's first instinct was to call out, to run toward the sound and help whoever was crying. But something held him back. Maybe it was the unnatural silence of the forest, or the way the air seemed to shimmer between the trees, but every survival instinct he had was screaming at him to be careful. Instead of shouting, he moved quietly in the direction of the crying, trying to stay hidden behind the larger trees. The sound led him to another clearing, this one smaller and darker than the first. The canopy was thicker here. And then, finally, after hours of searching for something, sitting on a fallen log with their back to him was a small figure. It looked like a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing what appeared to be a faded school uniform. They were hunched over, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Daiichi's heart was pounding so hard he was sure it could be heard throughout the forest. Every rational part of his mind was telling him this was impossible. Those children had been missing for 15 years. They would be adults now, in their early 20s. This couldn't be one of them. But as he watched, the figure slowly began to turn around. What Daiichi saw when that face came into view wasn't human. The features were wrong, stretched and distorted like they'd been pulled out of shape. The eyes were completely black, no whites visible at all, and the mouth was open too wide, showing teeth that were too sharp and too many. But worst of all, he recognized the face. Even distorted as it was, he could see the resemblance to one of the photos from the newspaper, little Yuki Tanaka, who disappeared 15 years ago. The thing that had once been Yuki stopped crying and smiled at him. It was the most horrible smile Daiichi had ever seen. Then it opened its mouth and spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through dead leaves. "We've been waiting for you to find us. We've been so lonely here in the burned places." That's when Daiichi saw the others. They emerged from behind trees and from inside the makeshift shelters he hadn't noticed before. 2 more small figures, just as wrong and twisted as the first. All 3 of them were smiling now, and all 3 were walking toward him with movements that were too fluid, too quick to be natural. Daiichi ran. He crashed through the underbrush, not caring about the noise he was making or the branches tearing at his clothes. Behind him, he could hear laughter, not the innocent laughter of children, but something cruel and hungry. He didn't stop running until he reached his truck, and even then his hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. He drove straight home and called in sick for the rest of the week. When he finally went back to work, he requested a transfer to a different patrol area. His supervisor didn't ask any questions, just nodded and reassigned him to the valley forests on the other side of town. Daiichi never went back to that burned section, and he never filed a report about what he'd found there. The official missing persons cases were never solved.